I was 28 years old when I realized that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had been quietly deciding that my life was worth less than my brother's convenience. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 11 years old. It wasn't a gradual discovery. One afternoon, I collapsed during a fourth-grade field trip to the Natural History Museum, and when I woke up, a paramedic was pressing a juice box to my lips and my teacher was crying on her phone. After that, everything changed. My whole childhood reorganized itself around blood sugar monitors, carb counts, and insulin pens. I learned words like hypoglycemia and ketoacidosis before I learned to drive. I understood that my insulin wasn't just medication. It was the thing standing between me and a body that would begin destroying itself without it. My parents handled my diagnosis the way they handled most difficult things in our family, by making it someone else's problem to manage. My mother would forget to refill my prescription until I reminded her twice. My father once told me, when I was 13 and crying after a particularly bad low blood sugar episode, that I needed to stop making everything about my health. I filed that sentence away somewhere deep in my chest, where it sat for the next 15 years. My brother was their pride. He was 3 years older than me, athletic, charming, and completely comfortable taking up every inch of space in a room. He graduated college with a communications degree and a habit of borrowing money he never returned. He worked sporadically, usually in sales jobs he quit after a few months. My parents covered the gaps without question. When he needed his car insurance paid, they paid it. When he got evicted from his apartment in Denver and needed somewhere to land, they converted the basement of their house in Columbus into what my mother called a temporary situation, which turned out to last 2 years. They never saw any of this as a problem. They saw it as family. I moved to Cincinnati at 20, Sawi 3 for a job in medical billing, which, yes, I appreciated the irony of, and built a small, careful life for myself. I had a 1-bedroom apartment near the river. I had a cat named Pretzel. I had a good endocrinologist named Dr. Yamamoto who took my management seriously and helped me finally stabilize my A1C after years of inconsistency. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and it was functional, and I was proud of it in the quiet way you are proud of something you built entirely without help. My brother moved to Cincinnati 14 months before everything fell apart. He said he needed a fresh start. My mother called me and used the phrase, "I want you two to be close," which I understood as, "Please take care of him so I don't have to." I told myself I would be supportive from a distance. I would have dinner with him occasionally. I would not become his safety net. What I didn't anticipate was how casually he would walk through boundaries I thought were obvious. The first time I noticed insulin missing, I told myself I had miscounted. I used an insulin-to-carb ratio system, and I kept my pens organized in a small, insulated case in the refrigerator. I thought maybe I had miscalculated how many units I'd used that week. I bought a new box, told Dr. Yamamoto at my next appointment, and we both agreed I should log more carefully. I logged more carefully. The units still didn't add up. The second time, I mentioned it to my mother on the phone. I wasn't even accusatory. I was genuinely puzzled. I said, "My insulin keeps running out faster than it should, and I'm logging everything precisely. And I don't know what's happening." My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure you're not just stressed? Stress can affect your insulin sensitivity." I said that wasn't how that worked. She said I had always been overly focused on my numbers. The third time, I found an empty insulin pen in my bathroom trash can. I had not put it there. My brother had a key to my apartment. I had given it to him when he first moved to Cincinnati, for emergencies, because that is what you do for family. He'd used it twice while I was at work, once to drop off a birthday gift when I wasn't home, once to borrow my portable charger. Neither of those things felt alarming at the time. I had trusted him the way you trust someone you grew up with, imperfectly and out of habit. I called him and asked directly whether he had been in my apartment. He laughed in that easy, disarming way he had, and said he had stopped by last Tuesday to grab a jacket he'd left on my couch. He said he hadn't touched anything. He said, with that particular edge he used when he wanted to make me feel small, that maybe I should talk to my doctor about whether my meds were affecting my memory. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for a while. I started researching. I knew insulin was expensive. I knew the resale market for medication was real, particularly for something like insulin analog, which people rationed and sometimes bought off the street because the cost of managing diabetes in this country is genuinely catastrophic for anyone without good insurance. A single package of the rapid-acting insulin I used could sell for $60–70. My brother was broke, perpetually, in the specific way of someone who has never been allowed to experience real consequences. I didn't want to believe it. That is the thing nobody talks about when you're in the middle of a situation like this, the sheer psychological resistance to accepting that someone who has eaten at your table, who you have shared a childhood with, is doing something this deliberately harmful. My brain kept offering me alternatives. Maybe it was a pharmacy error. Maybe my logging was wrong. Maybe. I bought a small security camera and installed it in my kitchen, pointing toward the refrigerator. This is the thing I want to be clear about, because I have asked myself many times why I didn't do it sooner. And the honest answer is that I kept hoping the evidence would stop before I had to see it. I kept hoping my brother would stop, or that I would find some innocent explanation, and that we could all pretend it hadn't happened. Installing the camera meant accepting that I needed to. It took 4 days. The footage showed my brother letting himself in on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at work. He went directly to the refrigerator, opened my insulated case, removed 2 insulin pens, and put them in his jacket pocket. He was in my apartment for less than 3 minutes. He didn't look uncertain or guilty. He moved like someone performing a routine errand. I watched the video 6 times. Then I made a folder on my laptop and saved it. I called my mother and told her what I had found. I described the footage in detail. I told her that I had been experiencing unexplained lows and highs for weeks because I was unknowingly using diluted supplies or stretching doses further than I should have been, without realizing that units were missing. I told her this was dangerous. I told her that poorly managed blood sugar over weeks causes cumulative damage that doesn't announce itself loudly, it just quietly shortens things. My mother was silent for longer than I expected. Then she said, "Have you tried talking to him? Maybe he thought it would be okay to borrow them." I told her insulin is not borrowable. You cannot return used insulin. And even if you could, he took it without asking and without telling me, which left me managing my own chronic illness with incomplete information about my own supplies. She said, "He's been going through a really hard time financially." I said, "He is stealing medication that I need to survive." She said, "I think you're being very dramatic about this, sweetheart." That word, dramatic. I had heard it my whole life, applied to every legitimate need I had ever expressed. Dramatic when I cried because I had to sit out of gym class during a bad week. Dramatic when I asked to keep juice boxes in my school bag without getting a lecture about sugar. Dramatic when I said, at 14, that I sometimes felt like my disease was inconvenient for everyone but me. I told her I was going to ask him to return the key. She said I was overreacting and that I was going to damage my relationship with my brother over a misunderstanding. I said it was not a misunderstanding. I had a video. She asked if I was really going to make this into some kind of legal situation over a few insulin pens. I hadn't said anything about legal situations. She had. I changed my locks that weekend. I did not tell my brother why, which meant he figured it out anyway, and he called me furious, using language I won't repeat, saying I had always held my illness over everyone's head and that it wasn't his problem that I was paranoid. My father called an hour later and said, with carefully measured disappointment, that he hoped I would reconsider my attitude before I said something to my brother that permanently damaged our bond. I want you to understand something about gaslighting in families. It doesn't happen in one dramatic confrontation. It happens in accumulated small moments where reality is quietly replaced with an alternative version that centers everyone's comfort except yours. By the time I got off the phone with my father, I had somehow become the problem. I had turned a simple misunderstanding into a family crisis. I had hurt my brother's feelings by changing my locks. I had always been difficult about my health. I documented everything. This was a habit I had developed in childhood without fully understanding why I kept records. I saved texts. I wrote dates and times in a notes app. When Dr. Yamamoto and I reviewed my glucose logs from the previous 2 months, she noted the unusual pattern of unexplained hyperglycemic spikes that I now understood were periods when I was unknowingly underdosing because my supply was short. She put her notes in my file. I asked her to. I didn't know yet what I would need them for. 3 months later, my grandmother on my father's side passed away. She was 81, and she had been ill for some time, and her death, while sad, was not unexpected. What was unexpected was the content of her will. My grandmother had never been particularly close to my brother or to me. She was a private woman who kept her feelings about her grandchildren largely to herself. But she had been, apparently, paying attention. Her will divided her estate among her children and their families, but it contained a specific provision allocating a portion of her savings, roughly $40,000, directly to my medical care fund, with a note written in her own handwriting that said simply, "For all the things she needs that no one makes easy." I read that note standing in my father's living room, and I had to press my lips together very hard for a moment. My brother did not receive a comparable provision. His portion was smaller and was structured to be distributed through my father as executor rather than going directly to him. My grandmother, it seemed, had watched him borrow and waste money his entire adult life and had made a decision accordingly. He was incandescent with rage. He contested the will. He hired a lawyer on credit and filed a formal objection claiming that my grandmother had lacked full mental capacity in the final months of her life and that the distribution was inequitable. My father quietly supported him in this, or at least did not oppose it, which amounted to the same thing. My mother called me and said she hoped I would consider agreeing to a voluntary redistribution to avoid putting everyone through a legal process. I said that I would not. I retained an attorney named Miss Patterson, who practiced estate litigation and who, upon reviewing the documentation and the clearly coherent and specific language of my grandmother's will, told me the contest was unlikely to succeed, but could drag on and cost money. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March. It was held at a conference room at my attorney's office building downtown, a clean and neutral space with a long table and bad coffee, and the particular airless quality of rooms where people go to fight over things that used to belong to people they loved. The plan was simple. Miss Patterson and I would present the validity of the will. The mediator would hear both sides. A resolution would be reached. I had been under significant stress for weeks. Stress is one of the most disruptive factors in blood sugar management, and I had been monitoring more carefully than usual. The night before the mediation, I checked my supplies, my pump settings, my backup pens. Everything was in order. I went to sleep with my glucose monitor set to alert me if I dropped below 70. What I did not account for was that my brother had been in my car. I had not given him a key to my car, but 2 nights before the mediation, he had shown up at my apartment building and asked if he could borrow my car to move some furniture. I said no. He left. What I didn't know, what I would only understand later, after everything, was that while he was in the parking garage waiting, he had access to my car through the passenger window I had left cracked. My emergency insulin pen, the one I kept in my glove compartment as a backup, was gone by the morning of the mediation. I didn't check the glove compartment that morning. Why would I? I had my primary supplies in my bag. I had checked those the night before. The mediation started at 9. My brother sat across the table with his attorney, a young man who kept shuffling papers. My parents sat at the side, technically present as witnesses, but functionally there as moral support for my brother. I sat beside Miss Patterson and kept my hands flat on the table and my breathing even. By 10:30, the discussion had grown heated. My brother's attorney was making the argument about capacity again, and Miss Patterson was dismantling it methodically. I was listening, tracking, taking notes on a legal pad, and then I noticed my hands. They were trembling. I checked my monitor under the table. 61. I had dropped without a clear warning. The monitor had alerted me at 68, but I had been focused and had thought I could manage it in a moment. Now it was 61 and dropping. I opened my bag and reached for my fast-acting glucose tablets. The small orange cylinder I kept in the front pocket was empty. I remembered now I had used the last ones on Monday and had meant to replace them. I had been distracted. I reached for my backup pen. It wasn't there. I reached for my phone to tell Miss Patterson quietly, and that was when the shaking in my hands got bad enough that I dropped it. The sound of the phone hitting the conference room floor was very loud. Everyone looked at me. I tried to say something. I remember starting a sentence and then the room tilting, not the dramatic spinning of movies, just a quiet, terrible sideways feeling, and then I was not sitting in my chair anymore. I was on the floor, and I could hear voices above me that I could not quite organize into meaning, and there was a sound like someone calling my name from a very long distance. The mediator called 911. Miss Patterson was on her knees next to me, her hand on my shoulder, telling me to stay with her. My mother was making a noise I could not identify. My brother, I was told afterward, said nothing. The paramedics came. They administered dextrose. My blood glucose came up to acceptable levels within minutes, and I was stable before they even moved me to the stretcher. In the ambulance, the paramedic noted from my medical ID that I was type 1 diabetic and asked when I had last taken insulin. I told her. She asked about my glucose tablets, and I explained they were empty, and I told her about the missing backup pen. She wrote something down. At the hospital, Dr. Yamamoto was not on call, but her colleague reviewed my file, which was thick with 2 months of documented irregular supply issues, her own clinical notes, and the corrected glucose logs. A hospital social worker came in and asked me questions. I answered them carefully. I showed her the video on my phone. I had uploaded it to cloud storage months earlier, when I'd first saved it. The police came to the hospital, not because I called them. The attending physician was required to document circumstances of injury when medication deprivation was potentially involved, and the documentation triggered a welfare inquiry. When I explained the full timeline, the video, the logs, the documented pattern, the missing backup pen found absent on the morning of a high-stress legal proceeding, the officer taking the report became very still and very focused in the way that people get when something stops being routine. My brother was questioned that afternoon. He denied touching the backup pen. He denied ever having stolen insulin. When the investigator mentioned the video footage I had saved, there was a long pause in the interview that the detective described to me later as telling. He was charged with theft of a controlled substance. Insulin is classified as a controlled substance in Ohio, which carries felony-level charges when the theft creates substantial bodily risk. Ms. Patterson informed me with a very measured expression that the mediation outcome had also shifted considerably in light of the morning's events. The mediator had witnessed firsthand what a decade of documentation had been quietly building toward. The contest of my grandmother's will was dropped within 2 weeks. My father called me once, after the charges were filed. He said he hoped I understood what I had done to this family. I told him I understood exactly what I had done, which was survive it. My mother sent a series of texts over the following days that cycled through anger and grief and a particular kind of bargaining that looked like apology but contained no actual accountability. At a certain point, I stopped reading them. I didn't block her. I just stopped. I want to say something about the moment on the floor of that conference room, before I end this. When you have a chronic illness, you spend a significant portion of your life managing other people's discomfort with your condition. You learn to minimize, to apologize, to make your needs take up less space. You say things like it's really not a big deal and I can manage it myself and I don't want to be a burden. And you say them so many times that you start to believe them. You start to believe that your body's requirements are an imposition on everyone around you, including yourself. What happened in that conference room took that narrative and broke it open in front of everyone in the room. My body, which I had been told for years I was too dramatic about, produced incontrovertible physical evidence of what deprivation does. Not hypothetically, not according to my logging system or my doctor's notes or my own careful documentation. Right there. In real time. In front of a mediator and 2 attorneys and my parents and my brother, I had spent 15 years being told to stop making everything about my health, and in the end, my health made everything about itself in the most public, undeniable way possible. I have a security system now. I have a spare emergency kit in 3 separate locations, my car, my desk at work, my gym bag, and I check them on the 1st of every month. I have a new endocrinologist, a new therapist, and a standing Friday night call with 2 friends who understand what it means to build a life around a body that requires constant negotiation. My brother received a suspended sentence, probation, community service hours, and a requirement to complete a substance diversion program. The judge cited his lack of prior record. I read the sentencing summary and felt, not the vindication I had expected, but something quieter and more complex. Something that felt like finally being believed by a room full of people who had no reason to doubt me and every reason to document it. My grandmother's provision stands, The $40,000 sits in a dedicated medical savings account. I have used some of it to cover the costs of continuous glucose monitoring equipment that my insurance rates as non-essential. I have used some of it to see a therapist who specializes in chronic illness and family dysfunction, which is a combination more common than people realize. I have used some of it to buy myself a very good winter coat, because my grandmother's note said for all the things she needs, and I think she would have considered a warm coat a medical necessity in an Ohio winter. I think about her sometimes, this small, quiet woman who watched her family from a careful distance and decided, at the end of her life, to say something true with her money that she had perhaps never quite managed to say with words. She saw what was happening. She had been seeing it for years. She left the only record available to her. I am trying to do the same thing. This is my record. Every word of it is true. If you are reading this from inside a situation that looks like mine, if you are the person in your family whose needs are called dramatic, whose documentation is called paranoia, whose very real, very physical requirements are treated as an imposition on everyone else's comfort, I want you to hear this clearly. Document everything. Save everything. Install the camera. Get the records in writing. Build your file. Not because you'll necessarily end up in a conference room on a Thursday morning in March with everything falling into place in the worst and most necessary way, but because the documentation is itself a form of refusing to be erased. Every date and timestamp is you saying, "This happened. I was here. This was real. They told me I was dramatic about my health for my entire childhood and adolescence and into my adult life. And what I eventually understood is that what they were actually saying was that they did not want to be responsible for the consequences of ignoring it. Calling me dramatic was how they avoided that responsibility. It was easier to make me the problem than to be accountable to my reality. I am not the problem. I never was. If you have been told that you are welcome, there are more of us than they want you to know. We have our records. We have our timestamps. We have our whole, complicated, high-maintenance, absolutely worth-defending lives. Keep yours.